I never thought a simple fire tank could become a neighborhood dispute. The tank had been on my property for years. It was there for one reason, to protect homes during an emergency. Then my new neighbor decided it belonged to him. I checked the tank every few months. The valves were maintained, and the water level was always monitored. It wasn't decorative equipment sitting in the yard. It was part of my property's emergency infrastructure. Everything changed when construction started next door. My new neighbor Mark was building a large house. At first, I was happy to see another family moving into the area. I had no idea what he planned to do with my fire tank. One afternoon, I noticed Mark and his contractor studying my property. They kept pointing toward the tank. I walked over to see what was going on. Mark casually told me it would be part of his new house's fire system. I thought he had misunderstood the property line. I explained that the tank was completely on my land. Mark simply shook his head and said the development plan showed otherwise. That was the first red flag. I pulled out my property survey. The boundary line was unmistakable. The tank sat several feet inside my property. There was no shared easement shown around it. I showed Mark the survey. He studied it for a few seconds. Then he said the tank was still necessary for his construction approval. I told him his building plans couldn't turn my property into his. Mark didn't seem worried. He said his architect had already included the tank in the plans. Apparently, someone had assumed it was available for the new house. Mark believed paperwork had already solved the problem. A few days later, workers showed up near the tank. They began measuring the ground around it. I immediately walked outside and asked what they were doing. Their answer made the situation even stranger. Steve told me the tank was being considered for Mark's fire suppression system. I reminded him that nobody had asked me for permission. Steve looked uncomfortable and said he was only following the approved plans. That meant someone had approved something they didn't own. That evening, I pulled out every document I had. The tank's installation records were still in my files. The maintenance receipts even listed my property address. There was no question about who owned it. The records went back years. The tank had been installed before Mark's property was ever developed. It was maintained as part of my private emergency system. I knew I had the documentation to prove it. The next morning, I photographed everything. The tank, the foundation, the valves, and the property line. I wanted a complete record before the disagreement became bigger. I also contacted the local fire safety office. I didn't call to start a fight. I simply explained the situation to the fire safety office. I wanted them to know that a private tank was being included in another property's plans. They told me an inspector would review it. The fire marshal arrived later that week. His name was Robert, and he immediately began asking practical questions. He wanted to see the tank, the property documents, and Mark's building plans. For the first time, Mark looked concerned. Robert inspected the tank from top to bottom. He checked the access points and emergency connections. Then he asked where the property boundary was located. I handed him the survey. Robert compared the survey with the construction plans. The difference was immediately obvious. Mark's plan showed the tank serving his property, but the tank itself was located entirely on mine. Robert asked Mark who owned the tank. Mark said it was part of the development's emergency system. Robert asked him to show the document proving that. Mark couldn't find one. Mark searched through his paperwork. He found building permits, engineering drawings, and utility plans, but none of them transferred ownership of my tank. The paperwork he trusted wasn't saying what he thought it said. Robert finally explained the problem. Mark's house could not depend on equipment he didn't control. A private fire tank couldn't simply become part of another property's emergency plan. That meant his approval was in trouble.